The late autumn sun hung low in the sky, casting long, golden shadows across the gravel path that led to the Montana Rescue K9 unit. The air was cool and dry, tinged with the scent of pine and smoke from distant chimneys. Leaves, crisp and sun-bleached, rustled underfoot as they danced in small spirals with each shift of the breeze. Their brittle whispers followed 8-year-old Leah Dawson as she moved slowly through the iron gate, its hinges groaning softly behind her. She looked too small to be alone, but she wasn't not really. Draped in her father's old fireman's coat, she seemed caught between two worlds, one where children played and laughed, and another where memories held more weight than words. The coat was far too large for her, the sleeves hung well past her hands, and the collar brushed her cheeks like a shield. But she wore it with purpose, not as clothing, but as armor. Armor that still smelled faintly of smoke and cedar and safety. Leah didn't speak. She hadn't spoken in months, not since the night her father, Ethan Dawson, had gone on a call and never come back. Her eyes, solemn and unwavering, scanned the rows of metal kennels that lined the path like quiet sentinels. Inside each one, a dog waited, some lying still, some pacing, some barking faintly at her approach. But she passed them all with barely a glance, until she reached the end. There, in the last enclosure, sitting motionless in the slanted light, was Shadow. The aging German shepherd didn't bark or pace. He didn't wag his tail or rise. He simply sat tall and steady, his fur grizzled with time, his body lean with experience, and his eyes. Those eyes held something deeper: recognition, sadness, hope. The moment he saw her, his ears perked. A slow, quiet shift passed through him, as though he truly knew what today was. Leah stopped just feet from his kennel. She stared at him, unmoving. The wind tugged at her coat. Her breath fogged faintly in the cooling air. Then, like a slow echo returning home, she took one step, then another, until she stood just inches from the fence. Neither moved, not at first. Then, with a careful grace that made the moment feel sacred, Leah crouched down, her knees folded beneath the oversized hem of the coat. One hand reached forward, small and pale, pushing gently through the gaps in the fencing. Shadow didn't lunge or bark. He simply leaned forward, placing his weight into the touch, his chest brushing the cold metal like he was trying to close the impossible distance between them. Leah pressed her hand against his muzzle, her fingers curling slightly as they sank into the coarse fur beneath his chin. She leaned forward, her lips brushing just an inch from his ear, and then, for the first time in what felt like forever, she spoke, not aloud, not for others to hear, but in a whisper so quiet only he could feel it. Shadow stilled, his ears softened, his breathing slowed. He lowered his head, not in submission, but in understanding. A silent pact, sealed not with words, but with presence. Behind them, two handlers stood near the doorway to the main office. One held a clipboard, the other a steaming cup of coffee. Both paused in quiet recognition. No one said anything. They never did. No one needed to. This wasn't a simple visit. It was something far deeper. A return, a reunion. There, in that quiet enclosure, stood a girl who had lost her voice, and a dog who never needed one. Together, they built a language born from silence and shaped by shared sorrow. It was a language no one else could speak, but everyone could feel. And in that golden moment, as the last light of the sun spilled through chain link and fur, Leah wasn't just the quiet girl whose father had died in a fire. She wasn't just the one who didn't speak. She was whole again. She was simply Leah. Every Saturday, precisely at 3:00 p.m., Leah Dawson and her mother Rachel passed through the same gate. They took the same path past the same kennels, past the same quiet glances of understanding from the staff. They didn't need appointments. They didn't need permission. They were expected. The jacket always came. And so did Shadow. He seemed to sense her arrival long before she appeared. Minutes before the girl turned the final corner, Shadow would rise slowly to his feet, his joints stiffened by age, but his body alert. His ears would tilt forward, his entire frame tensing, not in fear, but in readiness. And then, she would appear. She never ran to him, never rushed. Her steps were slow and solemn, like a ritual passed down through time. every stride deliberate, every inch closer, another page in a story only they remembered. Rachel followed a few steps behind, always close enough to protect, but distant enough to let the moment belong solely to them. Her eyes glistened, but her face stayed still. She carried no camera, no phone, no distractions, only quiet respect. Leia would crouch beside the fence, as she always did. She would set her sketchbook worn and smudged gently beside her on the ground, and then, through the fence, her hand would find its way back to the only place that ever felt steady anymore, the space behind Shadow's ear, where trust had once been planted and somehow still bloomed. Shadow leaned into her hand every time. Sometimes she would bring a new drawing, usually of her father in his fireman gear. Standing beside Shadow on seat was a picture of the three of them, their faces smiling in colored pencil, wearing red helmets. She would slip page through the gate, and one of the handlers would quietly pin it to the board in the staff lounge. Over time, those drawings became a timeline, aslant journal of healing. The handler watched from a distance, somewhere new and didn't know the full story. Other Shad worked alongside Ethan Dawson and remembered the day Shadow refused to leave the burning structure until Ethan had been found too late. They never interrupted. They watched a quiet girl sit beside a dog who didn't need words to understand her. She didn't flinch when other dogs barked or people passed by with Shadow. She was never on guard. She was at peace, and Shadow, once trained to detect danger, to charge into chaos, no offered something else: quiet loyalty, presence, and the comfort of Somion, who remembered what she could no longer say out loud when she leaned her head against his side. The memories came more easily: her father's laugh in the fire truck, as she sat on his lap pretending to drive the warm flashlight glow during blackouts as he read aloud. Shadow curled at their feet. It wasn't just the stories she missed, it was the feeling of safety they created together. Shadow didn't just remind her of that world, he kept a piece of it alive with Shadow. She wasn't lost, she was seen, and in being seen, she began very slowly toward her. The letter arrived on a when hysterical Dawson stood in the kitchen, her hands still damp from washing dishes, down at the official envelope from the Montana Rescue K9 unit. The words were typed neatly, the Tana professional, but one sentence reissued it like a cold hand: retired rescue dog Shadow, to be listed for public auction per department policy. She read it again: auction, as if he were equipment, as if it didn't matter. Her heart sank. Upstairs Leah was humming faintly, a small hopeful sound Rachel hadn't heard in years. Sheckled and destroy. That not yet. That night after Leah fell asleep, Rachel sat alone at the kitchen table, the letter beside a faded photo of Ethan in uniform, one arm wrapped around a toddler-aged Leia, the other resting on Shadow's head. She had promised to protect their daughter. She whispered, "I'm sorry, Ethan, I don't know how to fix this," but Leia had distanced something. The next morning, without a word, she disappeared into her room. Hours later, Rachel found her surrounded by old shoe boxes and crumpled paper. Leia had taken out every coin, every dollar she had ever saved: birthday card, school art contests, allowance money. From cores at the bottom of one box lay a stack of drawings, bright, expressive, and deeply personal, her best pieces. Leela looked up at her mother with a quiet certainty she was going to sell them a very own. Rachel knelt beside her, tears stinging her eyes. But she didn't stop her, she didn't say no, because this wasn't a tantrum, this wasn't a child wanting a pet, this was something sacred. Shadow wasn't just a dog, he was that thread that still tied Leela to Thieves of her father, to the warmth of safety, to a version of herself that hadn't yet broken. And Leela, still silent, still solemn, was willing to give away everything she loved just to keep one part of him close. They didn't Lanyon. There was no fundraiser, no press, no social media campaign begging for shares or sympathy, just two people, one mother, one daughter, moving quietly towards something that felt impossible. In the evenings, Rachel would help Leia count and recount the money. They laid it out in neat piles across the dining table with candles lit beside them, because Leia said it felt more serious that way: coins, crumpled bills, gift cards, and the drawings, each one wrapped in clear plastic, labeled with careful handwriting, and a price tag written in pencil. Some were landscapes, some were portraits. of fire trucks, once most detailed, showed Ethan holding Gila's hand with Shadows standing protectively beside. Myrtle couldn't look at that one for long at school. Ella stayed quiet, but something in her posture had changed. She sat straighter. Walked like someone with a mission her classmates didn't ask. Maybe Thazens it wasn't something they could fix on Thursday. Rachel printed the auction flyer and pinned it on their refrigerator. Leia looked at it every morning as she packed her small backpack. Inside were the drawings she hadn't sold yet, just in case. Friday afternoon, Rachel helped Leia choose what to wear. They didn't speak much, words weren't needed. Leia picked a soft blue dress simply, and Rachel ironed it twice. Then almost reverently she pinned Ethan's fire department badge over her daughter's shirt. That night, they ate dinner by lamplight. No television, no phones, just quiet. Rachel watched her daughter sitting at the table, fingers tracing the edge of a folded drawing. Shadows facet captured in charcoal. Not perfect, Butriel. It struck her then how much Leela had grown. Without words, how much strength could live in silence. She wanted to say something, something reassuring, something brave, but all she could manage was, "We'll do our best." Leia looked up and nodded once. After dinner, Leia quietly opened a small wooden box on her nightstand. Inside, nestled in cloth, was her father's fire department badge. She held it gently, tracing the engraved name with her thumb. She didn't say anything to her mother, but Rachel saw the way she tucked it carefully into her dress pocket before going to bed. It wasn't just a keepsake, it was a promise. If the drawings weren't enough, if the money wasn't enough, then the badge would speak for her. And in that moment, Rachel realized it was never about winning the auction. It was about showing up, about doing everything they could, about telling the world in their quiet way that some things weren't meant to be bought or lost. Some things like loyalty, memory, love, could only be kept by those who had earned them. The auction hall wasn't grand. It was just the community center gym, emptied of folding tables and decorated only with a few flyers and the scent of floor wax. But to Leia, it felt like a courtroom, a battlefield. And at church, all at once, she clutched her small purse against her chest, her blue dress ironed crisp, her father's badge tucked neatly above her heart. Rachel walked beside her, but said nothing. Sheck knew words wouldn't help now. Shadow was already there, in the far corner of their room, behind a cordoned-off space for their tired dogs. He sat perfectly still. The moment Leia entered, his ears perked and his eyes locked on her like a beacon. He didn't move. He didn't need to. She was calming. People in the room began to whisper, "That's her." Someone said, "That's the Dawson girl." No one approached the space around Leia. Seemed sacred. They took their seat in the front row. Rachel placed the envelope of money in her lap, hands gripping it tightly. The bidding began. Dog after dog was led forward. Names called, hands raised. Some dogs barked, others panted anxiously. But when Shadow's name was announced, Rescue Dog Shadow ID number M18, the room shifted. The handler opened the gate. Shadow didn't need guidance. He walked straight across the room and stopped in front of Leia. He sat and looked up at her. She placed her hand on his head. The auctioneer paused, then chuckled lightly. "Well," he said, "looks like this one already made his choice." Soft laughter rippled through the room. It felt for a moment like a story writing its own ending, until the side doors creaked open. Greg Miller entered wearing a press suit and expensive smile. Beside him bounced his daughter Sophie, about the same age as Leia. Her sparkly shoes tapped across the floor, and her eyes darted eagerly between the dogs. "Daddy, I want the tone," she said, pointing to Shadow. "He looks like a hero." Greg smiled. "You've waited long enough. If he's the one you want, we'll bring him home." He didn't know the story, didn't notice Leia. "Not yet," the auctioneer called out. "Bidding for Shadow begins at 500. Rachel raised her paddle immediately. Greg raised his 1,000. He said calmly. Rachel raised a again. 1,500. 2,000, Greg said, with a nod. Barely looking up, the room tensed. Whispers began again. Leia sat frozen, her hands clenched tight in her lap. Shadow pressed closer to her side. The bidding continued. 3,000, 4,000. Rachel was running out. The envelope felt thinner now, and for the first time since they'd arrived later, her eyes away from Shadow and looked at Greg Miller, then at Sophia bouncing in her chair. The badge at her chest suddenly felt heavier. Oh. Rachel said, her voice quieter, no more strained. Greg raised his paddle. 6. Rachel hesitated. The room seemed to hold its breath. The envelope in her lap was nearly empty. Greg leaned back, completely unaware of the storm. He had stepped into Leia, didn't cry, shouldn't plead, she simply stood. The room shifted with her heads turned. The auctioneer paused mid-sentence, then slowly Leela raked into the pocket of her dress and pulled out her father's badge. She held it with both hands, arms trembling slightly, but raised high enough for all to see. Silence fell. Her voice came out rough, like unused strings being plucked forth first time. Shadow is not a pet. The room froze. He's a rescuer. He saved people. He saved my dad. And now he saves me. Gasps rippled across the hall. Evensiphi stopped bouncing in her seat, eyes wide. Leela took a small step forward. Her voice trembled, but didn't break. He's the only one who remembers what my dad smelled like after a fire, the way his boots sounded on the stairs, the way hellawed she looked directly at Greg. You have money, you can get any dog, but I only have him. Shadow stood up, moving beside her, calm and steady, his body pressed against her legs as if to hold her there. La's hands clutched the badge tighter. He's the last piece of my dad. If I lose him, I lose everything I have left. No one moved. No one whispered. Redrickle was crying. Even the auctioneer lowered his gaze. Sophie watched Leia in stunned silence, the sparkle in her eyes dimmed, replaced by something quieter, confusion first, then understanding. She looked down at her own lap, the smile fading from her lips. Her hand reached instinctively for her father's sleeve, but she didn't tug, not yet. Instead, she looked at Leia the way a child sometimes looks at the ocean, overwhelmed, unsure, but deeply moved. And then gently, almost in a whisper, she said, Daddy, her keep him. Greg stood slowly. For the first time, he truly saw Leia, not just a girl in a dress, but a daughter. Carrying the weight of memory, turned to the auctioneer. Wherewith drain our bid. A long, silent breath swept through the room. Then the auctioneer nodded and tapped his gavel. Rescue dog. Shadow is awarded to Leidadon. No one cheered, but dozens stood quiet, respectful, in awe. Shadow looked up at Leia, and for the first time her silence had done more than speak. It had changed everything. The days that followed felt different, not louder, just lighter. Shadow now slept curled at the foot of Leia's bed, his breathing deep and even matching the steady rhythm of her healing heart. She didn't talk all at once, but the silence no longer felt heavy. It didn't sting, it didn't trap. Hirsch started by whispering to Shadow in the morning, then humming again in the afternoons, then words, small ones, found their way back first to him, then to Oracle, then eventually to the therapist had refused to speak to for 3 years. Her voice was soft but steady. Andriel. Over the weeks, something else began to change. Leela started joining in Mori at school, quietly at first, offering nods, then simple greetings. Eventually, Sheen's-word questions. In class, she laughed. Had she raised her hand, it startled some of her teachers. A few even cried quietly in the staff room at recess. She no longer sat alone. She didn't always run with the crowd, but she was there, present, a part of something. One day, Rachel found a small card in Ya's backpack. It was an invitation to a birthday party. Leia hadn't said a word about it, but Rachel saw the subtle smile when she asked, Do you want to go? La nodded. Shadow can come too, right? That night, Rachel sat on the porch as usual, coffee warm in her hands. Inside, she could hear Leia talking, just talking about school, about art, about what Shadow did when the mailman came by. It was like hearing sunlight trickle. Often sat on the porch in the evenings, a warm mug in her hands, watching Leia and Shadow in the yard, some medums playing, sometimes just sitting together, as if nothing else in the world needed to be done. The badge now hung by the front door, framed, revered, a quiet sim, not of loss, but of return. One afternoon, while walking past the local grocery store, a woman stopped Leia and smiled. You gave us all hope that day. Leia, not shy or afraid, she smiled. He gave it to me first. and beside her, as always stood Shadow steady Queetwol proof that healing doesn't always come from people sometimes. It comes from paws instead of hands from prison instead of words.